Alright, friends and neighbors, welcome back to another networking video. Today I thought I'd do a little tools reminder, or a reminder about tools, and then run through our basic DNS config. But also I thought we'd take a quick look at our topology, since we're adding more servers and things like that to us, to sort of remind us about where we are in all of that. First, our status. Remember that because we're building more to the testbed, it's going to get more complicated. So I always like to draw a cartoon, and for today, the one below will be sufficient. So as a reminder, the DNS that I built before was 172.16.01. So in order to not have to worry too much about changing all that configuration, I added DHCP Server to it, but I changed the scope, or the IP addresses that DHCP is giving out, to be this same network. So the clients will get an address on this particular network, the 172.16/24 network, and then everything will tie back to that. And I'm also giving out now that particular name server in the DHCP options. Alright, so the other thing to remember is that we are on hypervisor, so these are all VMs. And so I have them all right now camped on a NAT network. Now you could do this with Bridge, but I didn't want to confuse anything that's out on my regular network, and I didn't want to do host only because I wanted some access. But I did have to turn off the DHCP server on the hypervisor for this particular NAT network. Okay, so that's where we are right now. So the first thing that we want to talk about is the tools extension. I'm going to do some examples, right? We've already done the tools, but I just want to remind you that using a tool in its default configuration is fine, but also, not very illuminating. But it can also be a bit of a pain because it creates a lot of traffic sometimes that we don't necessarily want, or does more than we need to. And so the other thing that I'll remind you of now, and I'll try to remember when I'm doing the demo, is that in this particular case, I had to move my DHCP server to the new network. So I updated the config file and everything else, and I thought I was ready to go, and of course I forgot something. So I went to run system control start or restart my DHCPD.service, and then of course I got all kinds of errors. Oh, go see journal control and all of this. And what I had forgotten to do was change the interface. And it's not just enough to change the interface, because we like to give servers static IP addresses. It's not enough just to change the IP address. You got to make sure that it takes. So let's make sure that we remember that, and of course we'll go through our DNS stuff. Okay, so let's take a look at our VMs. So as you can see, I've got a collection of VMs here. We'll start with our client. Alright, so here we can see that the host name is client.1, and if I do an IPA, I can see that I have pulled a 172.16.0.20 address. Now to see where that ties in, of course, we'll take a look at our DHCP.conf. Whoops. Oh, for heaven's sakes. Okay, so a couple of things that we've got here that I'll point out. So I'll use the mouse to do it. Maybe I should VI, but it doesn't really matter. So I've changed the IP address of my DHCP server. I've made my name servers .1 and .2, and so I've got my primary and secondary DHCP servers as 3 and 4 on the network here. At least that's what they'll be when I'm fully configured. But right now we've got a .3 as our DHCP server. And I've got this option up here for name servers, .1, so that makes sense. And then the reason that my host got a 20, of course, is because of the range that I'm giving out on this particular network. And so I've only got one client right now. Everybody else is statically configured, and that is .20. Now, normally, well, let's take a look at something else while we're here. So if I do let's see, what was I going to do? Yeah, resolve.config. Okay, so we can see that in this particular case, we've got in resolve.config, the big thing that we want is the search, because this is what tells our host, by the way, you not only have a host name, but this is going to be part of your FQDN. And then the name server. Now, I didn't put that there. Right? That was generated by Network Manager. Now I could manually configure all this stuff either with the GUI or on the command line. I did not add the name server. The network manager did that the minute we did our DHCP client. Okay, so this is important because, of course, when we run something like NSLOOKUP, right, and I ask for the IP address, maybe, we'll just do something simple like an IP address, right? So there is the URL or the name that comes back with that, with the set of labels. But also if I do the opposite, now the fun thing is that you get to see now that I am actually using my DHC or my DNS for the resolution of these queries. And so when we do NSLOOKUP, right, NSLOOKUP on the client side is going to look for your DNS, obviously. And so it's important when you're doing your testing to go, okay, what does the client need to do? We need to have an IP address on that network, and then we need to, so that's with the DHCP sign. And then when you're querying your name server, do you have a name server? Is the name server set up to answer queries from this particular network or this particular host? Okay, so that's the host side. So we're going to get out of this for a sec, and let's do this. Now, the tools reminder. If I want to ping, say, my DHCP server, I can do that. And in Linux, it's a continuous ping. Windows does 4. But what if I don't want that? So the reminder is that you've got options to do here. So I could say, well, I just want to do a couple. There we go. So that's really handy when you're trying to do packet capture and analyze things. Maybe I want to do a size. So when we looked at fragmentation, we looked at size. So if I did something like this, right? Okay, now that's a continuous ping at 5,000 bytes. Ooch, baby, that's a lot. So maybe what we'll do is instead, well, let me move it down, there we go. Maybe what we'll do this. We'll say, we'll combine our options like that. Okay? All right, so these are some of the things that I wanted to remind you about with your tools. Make sure that you take a look at the options, and of course, if you're confused, look at the man pages. Really, really important sources for you. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the DHCP server. Here is the config on the DHCP server, and one of the things that we always do is we run when we want to test our DHCP config, right? On the DHCP server, it's pretty straightforward. It is this file. Now, there are things that are related to that, like resolve.config and things like that, but it's really the dhcpd.conf. That's the big deal here. Understanding DHCP, different animal, but to get one up and running, this is our config. Okay. So let's take a look at our DHCP server. So we're going to run dhcpd.config, and I have navigated to the correct directory, so that's handy. And what I'm going to do is this. We'll do a config test, and we can see that I'm not configured to listen on any interfaces. And so this sort of indicates that we got a problem with the server in one sense or another. So this might be because I didn't change my interface IP address, or the interface is down, or the server is simply not running. So I'm going to we're going to add the interface. So this is one of those options that's really handy when you're going to point your DHCP server at a particular interface, because it lists the MAC addresses and the scope and everything else associated with that. Now, as you can see here, there are some other options, but that's a really basic, handy-dandy thing to realize with configtest. Now, the other thing we don't want to forget is our ability to check our status. Whoops. So I'm going to run system control and just do a status of our DHCP server, because I've been futzing around with it a little bit. And we can see that currently it's inactive or dead. That's a problem. But I can also see that we've got leases that were previously given out there. Now, the other thing to remember is that we have a leases file, so don't forget that. So Status tells us that we probably ought to consider starting. Whoops. DHCP. Now we do a status. There we go. So we're active, we're running. There's our leases file that I was just talking about right here. And there we go. Okay, so that's just a quick reminder of some of the handy-dandy things that we can do with not only our tools options, but also DHCP, DHCPD.configtest, and checking your status. Okay, so let's take a quick look at our DNS. So first off, we'll take a look at the zone files. So we take a look at where we are. I'm in var named, and a quick ls will show you that I've got a forward zone file here and a reverse zone file. So let's first take a look at our forward zone. Now I'm not going to go through what all of these mean in this particular video, but some key ideas here are this origin. The origin is going to be appended to all of your names that you have down here. And so you can see that I've got a couple of different flavors of address. So this one would be ns1.bruce.com and dhcp1.bruce.com, and then the IP addresses associated with it. Now, the important thing to remember is that this is not, sort of written in stone. This is what we want it to be. So this is the database. This is the zone file. So when I query a DNS, hopefully the record is updated. But if I did a release and renew on my client over there and it got an address other than 20, then this record would, of course, be incorrect. So this is really about your services, not necessarily about individual clients. Okay, so that is our forward zone, and then we've got all of the characteristics that govern the operation of our DNS. And I've updated the serial number occasionally. I probably ought to do it again here, but one question that comes up is the hostmaster.bruce.com. That's completely made up, right? It's just the address maybe of the administrator of this, but so that could be anything. So let's take a look at the reverse. And here we have sort of the exact opposite. Now it's a reverse lookup. So this again is going to be appended to my IP addresses, and then we flop them and we get our IP addresses. So the thing to remember there and why it works this way is that where is the most specific portion of the address? Well, for a name it is the first part, and for an IP address it's the last part. And so this sort of maps those two to be in the same way. And then of course we've got the addresses, their pointer records pointing back to these particular hosts. Well, let's take a look at the config file. So here's where we are. Whoops, let's go here. Okay. And so we've got a couple of options up top here. These are not really the big parts that we're interested in, although there's an interesting one here. By default, it wants to listen on loopback. If you comment that out, it's going to listen on whatever IP address it thinks is going to be appropriate. So that's why the servers that you see coming up and the queries that are being answered are on 172.16.01. Alright, so we're not doing recursion on this, right? I think we've talked about that, and obviously I have no DNS sec going on here, so there's no keys or anything like that. And I'm not doing anything with IP version 6. We'll see why that's important here in a second. But here is the, the chocolatey, crunchy goodness that we have here. This is the big part. If I even wanted to do queries on localhost, just sitting on my own server, I've got to get these right. And so we've got to say, well, this is the name of my zone, and this is the file that it's looking for. Now you could have just put the file there, because in the upper part of this, the directory is defined. But I like to be really, really specific. Okay, and so there is my reverse zone and the file associated with that. So we can do named-checkconf. And I'll go back and do the check zone here in a sec. Oops. Whoops, spelling counts, kids. Oh, for heaven's sakes. Oh, for heaven's sakes. Okay, so this comes back with no argument, but again, not really all that helpful, so maybe there's a way that I can get a little more information about what's going on here. And I'm going to do that with just the -z. Now the really handy thing about this is that it tells me a little bit more about what my config is going to be looking for and what zones I'm actually checking against. So this is actually pretty handy. We can see here that it's got some stuff for IPv6. I'm not doing anything with that. The other thing that we can do, of course, is we can do our status. So if I do system control, oops, come on, there we go, named-d, I can see again that I'm running. I've got the process IDs associated with that, and then maybe some details about hosts and things like that. But there we go. There's some a really quick look at some of the things you can do with your check config in named-d, but also taking a look at your status. Well, let's do a quick look at the zone checks. How do you do a zone check, or how do you run check zone? Okay, so the tricky part about check zone is that you're going to be using the tool to check a zone against a particular file. And so we're going to do named-d check zone, and the zone that I'm going to check is bruce.com, and we're going to check that against our forward. And tab is handy. And we can see that the serial is loaded here. Now the serial number tells us whether or not this file has been updated, and of course every time you touch it you should increment this a little bit, and then it comes back as okay. And then what is the reverse zone? And I guess this is one of the more tricky things about naming convention, particularly when it comes to the reverse zone. So we come back down here, we know that the zone is, there's the actual name of the zone, 0.16.172, internet address .arpa, and then the file is going to be the reverse zone file. So if we go back over there, so if we just think backwards, here we go, okay, 0.16, whoops, 172, whoops, in-addr.arpa, and then the reverse zone file. And it comes back again with the zone says, all right, here's the serial number that loaded, and it's okay. So that tells me that my zone files are okay. Now this is of course not a guarantee that your DNS is going to be working. Even if your check zone runs and your check config runs, it's not a guarantee that things are going to be a-okay. But it is a pretty good indicator that your syntax is okay and that you've accomplished things. You have to remember that there's got to be a tie between whatever you put in that forward zone file, whatever you put in the reverse zone file, and then naming your zones correctly in the config file. Alright, well that's it for this video. This was a reminder about those tool extensions. Do not be afraid to take a look at the man pages, or in Windows, /?, or just use no arguments. A lot of times it'll bring up the help page so that you can see what options you have available. Don't be afraid to experiment a little bit. Remember your files, remember your locations, and think about how the clients are going to work. And by that I mean that if you configure a client and you want to do NSLOOKUP, or you want to get an IP address, does the client have the ability to talk to the server that it's after? Is the server configured to listen on a particular port? Is it configured to answer requests? What's your firewall status? I mean, all of these things are questions to make sure that your clients are going to be able to get the information that they need. Right? What IP addresses are we talking about? It's really, really easy to mess up a server. If you forget to bring the interfaces up, you give interfaces the wrong IP addresses. If you've got extra DHCP servers out there. And when in doubt, draw a cartoon, draw a topology diagram, figure out where things are. So get yourself organized. Change your interface And hey, play some music in the background and I've got some great tunes for you. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if I helped, and may those packets always reach those destinations.